well as a team, we're constantly trying to come alongside you parents and give resources and help with how we're just raising kids, and we're trying to do it well and to do it with the Lord. And so Dave, I've known for a really long time, had his oldest daughter on a missions team. His son was a student of mine, and he is...
And to give you a timeline, my kid, Rachel's 30.
Rachel's
36.
How old are you, Dad? I was brand new in ministry. You are something else. So I was going to talk about how cool he is. He's got like a PhD and a couple of masters. I don't really care anymore. No, but really, he's incredible. And the thing that I love about Dave is he knows all of this. He teaches counselors how to be counselors. But really, he's actually all about it because he's here. He's willing to do this for free. He even already promised me that he would come back. You're all witnesses. Go ahead, nod to the camera. Yep, I got it. So he really wants to help parents. He loves the Lord and loves kids and wants to help families. And it's enough that he doesn't just do it as a profession. He does it for the kingdom. And so he's here for you guys. And so I'm just really honored that he would even come and help us. He's got a lot of useful tools, so I'll stop talking so he can start. But thank you so much for being here.
You bet. So we're going to jump right in. So last night, how many people were here last night? A few of you. So just a quick review. The approach that I take is really based in what you can think of as human development. And so each of us, including all of us in here, are in a developmental stage. And this, what you see right here, is the kind of a classic representation of what the developmental stages are. So for those of you that are 22 to 40 about, you're in what is known as the intimacy stage of development. And what that means is that you're developing a relationship. So intimacy means commitment to possibly to a partner, to a career. You choose a place to live. And so during the 22 to 40, what you're looking for is that a person can take...
Sorry, I'm going to clip your mic so it doesn't fall off.
Okay. So a person can take their identity, which was in the developmental stage prior to this. So at age 13, roughly to 20 or 21, you take that identity and then you try it out in adulthood, and hopefully you find the right things that you can commit to, because then the next stage of development is productivity. So from 40 on, you're kind of expected to produce. And if you haven't kept commitments that you've made, like if the sooner you get off track on the human development roadmap, the more difficult it is to get back on track. So if you make commitments in 20 to 40 that you can't keep during the productive years, that becomes very disruptive. So one of my sons is 25, and if he was to change job right now, that wouldn't really impact, there would really be no significant impact. If I went home to Hollis right now and told her that I think I'm done being a counselor and I think I'm going to go back into remodeling work, that would be a major turnover that would cause a lot of problems. So the idea is that each stage develops on the stage prior to that. So what we're gonna focus on is identity, but just real quickly here. So each of these charts, and obviously you can take these and study these later, have the arrows going around, and that's because when you're in the developmental stage, you're working on it repeatedly. It's not something that you just do one time. So for example, during identity formation, so how many people have teenagers? I'm assuming just about everybody. Okay. So what do we know about teens? How would you characterize teens? Emotional? Dramatic? Yeah, and in order to try and find themselves, they try different things out. Some of those things are positive things, some maybe not so positive. Have you experienced with teenagers that they're able to change directions pretty quickly? So, well, it depends, I suppose, on the teenager. but sometimes they can kind of be into one thing and then they're all about that, and then kind of with no notice, or you're not really sure what happened, they're into something else. And that can be something as simple as clothes. It can include friends. It can include activities that they're involved in. It can include music that they're into. I mean, it's kind of all of the above. And during your teenage years, that's actually okay to do that. I mean, we sort of expect that. As a parent, you can get whiplash sometimes because you're probably in your late intimacy or early productive years, and you would like stability in the evening when you come home, and you don't get that necessarily, so that can be very challenging. But we also know that teenagers can change their minds, and it doesn't really disrupt the process much in terms of what's going on, because we're kind of geared for that. So each one of these stages is something that's going on repeatedly during that developmental window. So and we talked about this last night, but just to bring everybody else up to speed, our main subject we want to look at is individuation. And individuation is a pushing away while still trying to hold you close. And the first evidence that that is present is at ages 1 and 2. Typically a child develops mobility, and so now they have the ability to actually physically move away from you. And so they'll try that out, everything from playing peekaboo to running away from you when they're being disobedient. They try to get away from you. So this stage of individuation is actually kind of cute, and it's pretty easy to deal with. As we go forward, we're going to be looking, so the first phase of individuation is ages 1 to 2. The second phase is 13 to 18. And then the final phase, hopefully, is sometime in the early 20s when the child develops full independence from the family of origin. They're financially responsible, and they're kind of on their own. Now, I said each one of these builds on the one prior, the successful completion. So the stage 1 is trust. Stage 2 is I can push you away. So if I can trust the world and I can push you away, the next thing I want to do is try things out for myself. And so your 3 to 5-year-old is trying out all kinds of different things that they want to do. That's like, let me do it myself, which leads to the first protracted stage is the stage of industry. So that was the middle school kids that we were talking about last night. And in industry, the thing we emphasized last night is kids are learning that in order to be good at something, they have to practice. So they can try out a lot of different things, but now, for example, sports starts becoming competitive. And some of you may have experienced it becomes too competitive at times in terms of the expectations on the kids. But they start getting compared to other children, which is not entirely a bad thing, and they start looking for their place in terms of what they're good at. And so as parents, when we're working kind of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, the stakes start getting higher for them to stay involved with something that they've chosen. So we still allow them to switch, but when they're 5 and 6 and changing their mind, we don't really ask them to remain kind of the same. But here's where we start saying things like, if you start the season in soccer, you need to finish it, so on and so forth, because the key thing is they learn that if you want to be proficient, you have to practice that thing, which leads then to, and so here we are in adolescence. So if a kid has had, and when I say successful completion, human development is really sloppy, and so I don't mean that these things work out like perfectly. Like on the trust issue, for everybody in this room, based on the fact that you're here and you have kids, likely you achieved basic trust from 0 to 12 months. It's probably not perfect. You may have some mistrust. You may have some inherent concerns about whether or not people are trustworthy, but you have achieved it at a functional level. So with each stage, if the child has developed trust, the ability to push away, the permission to try things out, then they've learned some of the skills of industry, they practice. Now the stakes go up, and now they're in high school, and they start choosing things that they're kind of expected to stick with. And so if they're typically, like I had a high school student, this is really common, he's in a class, he's not doing well in the class, and so he goes to the school counselor and says, I want to switch to another class. And the school counselor says, well, what have you tried? And so there's some pressure for that child to stay in that class and try and figure it out before we change. So a few years ago, well, actually, I wish it was a few years ago, one of my kids was in high school and was leaving on, it was a sports, they were headed to Southern Oregon, so she had to take a test before school. So at the time I was probably, say late 40s, and I had to sit with her sports gear just outside the front door to the old high school in Sandy. And so as a 40-something-year-old, I'm invisible, and all these kids are, and I hadn't sat in front of a high school and watched kids come in. Why would I have a reason to do that? And it was really interesting to see the angst on their faces and to see them they came in groups. And so, like, the goth kids are being different in groups. And of course, the kids that are into athletics are coming in together. They kind of form these social groups. And as they're doing that, they're trying to find some place that they can step out and be noticed in a positive way. They want to build their own values, so the things that you're trying to impart to them, they start possibly becoming resistant, or they start throwing out kind of new ideas to challenge you. And they're taking risks with higher stakes. And obvious ones, of course, are getting a driver's license, but you giving them more freedom to be out on their own, giving them perhaps freedom to be out later at night. All those kinds of things those are a lot higher stakes than the freedom that 6 to 12-year-olds have. And what you're looking for, and this is out of your control to a large degree, what you're looking for is that they have some successes. So what we really hope is that during the teenage years, each kid has something that they do. So they are a baseball player, they're good at math, they're on the chess team, they're on speech and debate, so that they can have an area where they can actually feel competent. On your handout right now, I want to jump way ahead, about halfway through. See if you can find the slide that says post 9/11 kids. So for today's, again, for those of us that are aging, this is hard to believe. So today's seniors in high school were born 2004. So these are kids who 9/11, which probably all of us in this room can tell you where we were when that occurred. These are kids who that's a history lesson that they're not really sure about, kind of like what previous wars were for you when you were in school. And the world they've grown up in, 2004, when they were 5 years old, the economy tanked. We had people who were having homes. I think at the time in 2009, I think in our practice we probably had 20 clients that had to file for bankruptcy and went into foreclosure and lost their homes. And these were people who were quite functional in their lives and had based their decisions on an economy that was growing. And so these kids, since you start forming memories around 5 or 6, they've grown up with economic instability, national insecurity, international insecurity, terrorism is a norm, school shootings. I started noticing probably around 2010, the work I was doing with younger people, so teenagers or early 20s, took a pretty dramatic shift, and I could illustrate it by a kid one day as I was kind of talking about, he was a late teen, his parents were concerned about what he was going to be choosing, And he pretty much directly said to me, I'm not really concerned about all of that stuff because I don't think about the future because it's so dark. I'm just interested in what I'm doing today, and I want to do things that make me happy. And there was this sort of apocalyptic hedonism that kids started walking into my office with, which was completely new. I had not ever dealt with this before. And there are kids who have been in the technology transformation where you are, so drop down to the fourth thing here. With technology, you can't escape your problems. The lines between the online world and I can't even do this anymore. The online world, and I was about to say the real world, are completely blurred. 3 of my kids are in the tech industry, and when they were in high school, so they graduated, they were born in 96, 97, 99. We used to get into discussions when they were teenagers about whether the virtual world was a real world or not. And as far as I can tell, my kids were right, that this has become it's become integrated into the real world. And there is this hyper-connectedness where they are overexposed to information. To repeat something from last night, in terms of brain development, the self-control that should be required to have something simple like an iPhone, neurologically, that self-control is probably present in the very late teens or the early 20s, and for the male brain, it may even be later than that. The male brain continues frontal lobe development from 21 to 28, and the frontal lobe development is the executive functions. And so that's the part that says I probably should stop looking at TikToks and do some work. That kicks in the early to mid-20s. So there's this overexposure where they can't sort of not see what's out there. And yes, you can try to put parental controls on their phones. If you're not aware of this, it's not uncommon, and this is kind of a moral dilemma or ethical dilemma for me. I'll have kids come into therapy and their parents have kind of cracked down and taken their phone away from them, and they have their second phone that they carry with them that they got from a friend or they picked up somewhere. And the second phone is a phone that the parents don't know about. And as a therapist, I have to build an alliance with this teenager. I now know about the other phone. I mean, you can kind of see where I'm in a tough spot if I was to go to the parents and say, hey, your kid has a second phone. Were you aware of that? My relationship with the teenager is over at that point. And that they didn't teach us about that in graduate school. When I was in graduate school, to date myself, we didn't have cell phones. So we're learning while we do this. And I think as adults, one of the things that I would say to you is that this world that the kids are living in, where they're overexposed, they're hyper-connected, and here's a quote from a 17-year-old, it's like the whole school is in your bag waiting for an answer. The demand they feel for their phones. We were headed into Canada back, this would have been, let's say my son Aiden was 16, so let's play this 9 years ago, it's 2013. We're headed into Canada, and I didn't want to pay for the international plan if we had an AT&T account, and so as we're approaching the border north of Seattle, we had 3 teenage boys with us, and we're like, okay, this is it. You're going to shut your phones down, and it's going to be a week before you have access. And they're back there, and the messages are going out, and their life is ending here. And so we get the phones shut off. We go into Canada, we went to Glacier, camped, so on and so forth, just kind of what you'd expect. It was a great week. We came back, we were in the Canadian Rockies, and then we were coming down into Glacier, so coming back into the United States. We crossed the border just north of Glacier, and they've got their phones out, because as soon as we make it through that inspection station, phones are going back on. And so we cross through, and the phones come on, and I'm driving down the road, It's a 2-lane kind of quiet road. And I hear my son Aiden, I hear a very deep sigh. It's just like, and so we're like, well, what's going on? And he said, I'm not sure if I should be happy or sad. He said, I didn't miss anything. And you hear the dilemma there. They want to be included, and he lives in a world where his phone is really important. He loses it for a week, he turns it back on, and he finds out he didn't miss anything. And you can probably feel the dilemma for that teenager. That's very confusing for them. Now, this is the world that teenagers are in. This is also the world that you're in. I actually recall the moment that a teenager complained to me. This is the first time it happened. I had been dealing with parents complaining about their teenagers' electronic use, and to put a date on this, it would have been post when Facebook came available to the general public. So it was available for college students with an EDU address, let's say 2006 through 2008 or so, and around 2009 or 2010, it becomes something that all of us can get on. And I had a teenager who wanted to complain to me about her parents' use of their phone and that she couldn't get their attention. And I was like having like this cognitive distortion moment. Wait a second, they're supposed to complain about you. Well, since then, it now is probably something that happens every single week, that I have kids talking about their parents' connectedness. These things, it's not just for our kids that they can't escape their problems, but now we're connected. Like, maybe this has even happened to some of you. I've had clients who, like when the first iPhones came out, one of my clients said, so we were at work, and he was a white-collar worker, and he said, so they said, we've got new iPhones for everybody. And so everybody's, I mean, you remember maybe what it was like to hold your first iPhone, and this is like the most cool thing you've ever seen. And they said, and now the bad news is that we expect you to have them on 24/7. And these are the company's phones, and we need to have access to you. And this is the kind of expectation that all of us are dealing with, whether we're in the world of work or not. I mean, socially, when a text is sent, the ball's kind of in your court. How many of you have your notifications for the other person turned off that tells them whether or not the text message was delivered? Because you have that. Yeah, mine are off because I'm kind of like, that's my business. Because if they see delivered and they see read, it's like, I mean, because I feel this myself. You know, if I send my kids a text and it says, which is interesting, my kids don't care about these. So my kids right now are 22 to 36. They don't care about these. They don't mind. They use Venmo, which publishes all of your transactions to the world. So you can see that Esther just paid somebody for food. They were out at a restaurant. They don't think about these things because their lives have been so public. But I feel it myself sometimes. If I send a text to my kids and it says delivered and then it says read, then I'm like, okay, you know, what's taking so long? How come, you know, come on, respond. Your dad texted you. Let's go. And that's a microcosm of this world that we face, where we are hyper-connected and overexposed. The main reason I wanted to put this slide up there is because I wanted to tell you that in the area of electronics, the most powerful teacher is social modeling. And so whatever it is you're doing with your electronics, that's going to be the most powerful teacher for your kids. And if they see you overconnected and overexposed and you can't set it down, that's going to make that, if you will, a menu item for them. If, on the other hand, you're practicing things like perhaps a digital Sabbath, where, you know, for 24 hours on the weekends, you guys all put your phones in a basket, or like we do things like no phones in eating areas. So in our kitchen area where we gather for food when we're together as a family, no phones in there. I do most of the cooking, and to me, cooking is kind of this, semi-religious Zen thing. And so when we're preparing food together, I don't want to be distracted by phones. So I kind of have that in the kitchen area also. Hollis, when the kids were teenagers, everybody wants to sit shotgun. And so if you're sitting shotgun, you can't be on your phone. You have to be available to talk to the driver. Whatever you come up with, what you have to do today is you have to teach your kids how to use their electronic equipment, because if you don't teach them how to use it, it will use them. And they'll have that sense that 17-year-old has, where it's like the whole world is waiting for you, and then you have the famous fear of missing out. Is that FMO, they call it? What is it? FOMO, yes, thank you. And again, I think as adults, we experience some of that fear of missing out also. So if whatever your expectations are of yourself, my parents used to jokingly say to me, and I knew they were being sarcastic, do as I say, not as I do. And even back in the 60s and early 70s, they were aware that what they did was more powerful than what they said. So you've got to take this seriously and have, if you will, really family values around how are we going to manage these things, because they are now part of our lives. We have wearable tech, the watches. You're probably aware the Google glasses came out too soon, and we weren't ready for those, but those are going to be coming back again real soon. So tech is going to integrate itself further and further into our lives, and your job is to model how to use that. So with that said, let me go backwards here. So this slide right here. What we don't want to happen. So sometimes we can learn what to do by looking at what not to do. What we don't want to happen is to have a teen kind of finish up high school with confusion over who they are, no real sense of identity. They didn't really master any skills. They never had something that they did, that they were known for. Because now we're launching them into either college or the vocational world, and that identity formation has not solidified, and they're being put in a position where they have to start making commitments. Because there's this expectation. People start saying to them, what are you going to do? I mean, that's oftentimes what parents are kind of like, what are you going to do? What are you going to decide on? Now, there was a window of time that included when I went to school. Some of you may be aware of Azusa Pacific University. It was Azusa Pacific College when I went there. So I went to Azusa for 4 years, graduated from there, lived on campus, and had a meal ticket for the cafeteria, which was open a grand total of 5 hours a day, not like it is today, if you're aware of food plans at universities. And my entire education, room, board, and tuition over 4 years was $16,000. So today, at Azusa Pacific, $16,000 will not buy one semester. So there was a window of time where you could go to college and continue to work on identity. But even with our kids, we said we're not involved unless you're picking a degree that is job producing. So I majored in political science. This is not a job producing degree. And in those days, you could get away with that. You could do some liberal arts study, and you could still get a job because you were a college graduate. Well, today, the college degree has become almost like a high school degree. It's become expected, partially because we've financed so many kids that actually couldn't pay to go through it. I deal, even in my field, so I do a lot of supervision of counselors who are just coming out of graduate school, and it is not unusual for me to have a person sitting in front of me that has $120,000 in debt. They're 28 years old, and they're a rookie in the field. You can't get your license for at least 2 more years, and their loan payment is basically a mortgage payment. And I don't know how you dig out from that. So more and more kids, and 2 of ours have, out of our 6 kids, 2 of them said, we're not taking that debt on and we're not going to college, which was kind of heartbreaking for me, but at the same time, I get it, because they did not want to be that 28-year-old. They are even right now. Dylan's 22, and he talks about this a lot, because Hollis would like him to go to school and have college experience, and he's afraid of incurring that debt. And he's part of the world that doesn't have that positive of an outlook in terms of, I don't know if you've noticed the increase in apocalyptic movies, and then when was the last time you saw a positive apocalyptic movie? Like, we solved climate change, and we somehow figured out electronic devices, and we're singing Kumbaya and getting along. As the world. I just finished, you probably all binge on some shows. I just finished the Amazon Prime series, The Expanse, while I was working out. I watched it. And it was set maybe 200 years into the future. Mars had been colonized. The Earth was run by the UN. And then there was a system called the Belters that were basically the blue-collar workers that was the supply chain to keep the Earthers and the Mars people supplied with the resources they need. And the problems they portrayed in this series were the exact problems we have right now, only multiplied by that expanse of space. There is not a lot of prediction that we're going to figure things out, and this is the world that your teens are thinking about. And so when it comes to planning for the future, they don't have the motivation that you had when you were going through school to do that, because hopefully you thought of the future as something that included opportunity. And they see a planet that it's being predicted is not going to last. And so we've got a significant problem right here to try to work with them to say it's important to commit yourself to something so that you have a future when they're thinking, I don't necessarily have a future. I'm curious if you feel like I'm overstating this or what your experiences are. You don't think so? Andre, how old are your kids?
Depending on kids' personality, though.
17? Okay, let me come back in just a minute. Question?
I just said I see a difference dependent on personality.
That does play into it. This is anecdotal. Anything I say, this is not something I can prove to you. I've seen a decrease in optimistic teens in my office. We do have the first set of studies are coming in post-pandemic effect on teenagers. I know none of us trust studies anymore, so I feel a little silly going, I have a study for you, and you're like, yeah. I used to be able to, when I was speaking, I would go, the research says, and everybody's like, oh, I need to write that down. And now it's the research says, and they're like, I don't know about you. So what this is, and let me use a term that's not that technical, but it's something you should know. This is what's called a meta-analysis. So this is not one study. This is a group of researchers that took the 500 studies that were done during the pandemic on teenagers, and they analyzed the entire data pool. In other words, they take that entire data pool and put it in and then run the numbers on this much larger. And so what it does is, suppose you have a study that is funded by the pharmaceutical company. So you know that in that study, the researchers have a stake in showing that people are depressed, and because that means more drugs will be sold. And this happens, if you're not aware of it, this happens. And then there are also people who have a bias towards showing that number lower. A meta-analysis dilutes all of that and kind of gives you a pretty good picture of what the overall results are. So prior to the pandemic, if you use the criteria that counselors use to diagnose teenagers with depression, it was roughly 1 out of 10. So about 10% of teenagers were diagnosably depressed. Post-pandemic, right now, it's 1 out of 5. In having an anxiety disorder pre-pandemic, it was approximately 1 out of 8. And frankly, being a teenager, I mean, I think probably all of us had some anxiety. Being a teenager is an anxious thing to do. It was 1 out of 8. Post-pandemic, it's 1 out of 4. We have so many calls right now at River Ridge that when I finished today and I was going out to lock up, I had somebody sitting in the waiting room who was there basically to beg me to see their person. And that's the state of affairs in counseling. It's hard for me to name a counselor right now that has space in their caseload, and the waiting lists are up to, mine's probably 6 months right now to get in. And it's like we can't do anything. I mean, it's causing us angst too because we can't do anything about that. So this right here, this process that teens have to go through is angsty enough without the world that has been created in the last 20 years. The world that has been created in the last 20 years just multiplies what was going on and really tears away the foundation because we don't have, for example, we don't necessarily have families at home that are feeling stability either because of all that has occurred, the polarization that has occurred in families. We've had a front row seat to watch families break up over politics and medical advice in the last 2 years, and there was never anything like that. And it's happening to really good people. And again, this is the world that the teenager is living in right now. Now, I'm telling you that not to be negatively apocalyptic myself, but to really take seriously, this is the context. And right now, to parent a teen, you've really got to be bringing your A game to the table because there isn't a lot of space for not being available or the things that kind of distract us away from our parenting, where maybe the parents in my generation could kind of get away with that because they knew if I was over at a friend's house, those parents were probably pretty reliable and they didn't really need to check in on. You don't know that today. You have no idea. I shared an anecdote last night. One of my kids was given an ounce of medical grade marijuana for free on the middle school bus in Sandy. And this, I mean, that first of all, should have cost a lot of money. Second of all, it shouldn't have been available on the street like that. And that wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, that was a little unusual, but the access to things as a parent, I don't want you to be hyper vigilant. I want you to be present. Because right now, that's what your teens need. By the way, the number one thing that teens need to deal with anxiety and depression is not a therapist, although hopefully a therapist can help, and hopefully a stable family can help. The thing that actually impacts them the most is a stable, supportive peer group. And so the last 2 years created a significant problem with anxiety and depression and then ripped away the very opportunity for the thing that may have helped them. They thrive having a friend that listens and, if you will, understands and, some form of teenage saying, yeah, I get you. I'm going through the same thing. If you watch humans in general, when they're sharing their angst, if they're able to actually talk to somebody else who says, I understand, I'm going through the same thing, that's actually more powerful than 60 minutes sitting in my office where I'm listening, but it's something I'm trained to do. I don't necessarily have the freedom to say, yeah, I get you. Although there have been days in my life where my problems were so large, I was like, really? You want me to compare notes with you? Okay, so what do we do? Because I don't want this to be, we just don't know what to do. Okay, so what not to do, quick review. Don't parent with obedience as your goal. I'll tell you what I want you to do in just a minute. Don't create your clone. I hope you have enough self-awareness that you're understanding that the primary task of your teenager is identity, which occurs with the foundation of individuation. They have to push away from you. They have to have an area where they can be different than you. Don't interpret their difference as a deficit, because without even knowing what the details are, I can tell you they're going to try to do something differently than you. It might be their approach to spirituality, it might be their approach to academics, it might be the way they dress, it might be the way they conduct themselves socially. They need space. Don't parent out of disappointment. And this can cover a variety of situations. I'll give you a very real and painful one. So my wife Jillian died in 2005. We had been married for 25 years. And when kids lose a parent, you have a tendency to want to be soft on them. I mean, they lost their mom. And so when they misbehave, I got a call from a dad. My son had been over for a sleepover, probably like 3rd grade or 4th grade, and the dad was sure that my son had stolen $10 from his son. And your tendency, actually being a professional in the world of children's grief, believe it or not, one of the things that occurs is they start stealing. And the theory behind it is they're trying to control something. Something big happened that they can't control, so they'll try to do arbitrary little things that they can control. But you can't parent from a place of disappointment. You have to communicate to them. Hard things happen. This may sound harsh to you. This was said to me. I would not say this to a child, but I will say it to you as an adult, because one of my mentors said it to me after Jillian died. He said, he goes, bad things happen, and this time they happen to you. And as harsh as that sounds, that was actually a pretty good reality check for me, because when you think about it, who in life really escapes hard things happening? And it doesn't take very long of looking around to realize there's a lot of people that are worse off than you in terms of bad things happening. Part of your job as a parent is to communicate and validate understanding to the child's feelings, but also to maintain the expectations of function. And this is artwork. This is super hard to do. But there are so many opportunities to parent out of disappointment, and it always ends poorly. It always ends poorly. And then sometimes I'm concerned that in the Christian community, we'll use isolationism as the primary parenting tool, like we're going to keep everybody close and we can't interact with the world out there. It only works for so long, and it'll backfire on you as the kid ages and they age out of the isolationism. And if they then face the world, I can give you an example with drinking. Most kids, so if I was to tell you that I'm actually for lowering the drinking age to 18, the reason that I'm for that is there's plenty of research to demonstrate in countries where kids are included in the social modeling that goes on with drinking in the family. Right now, our kids are learning to drink with their friends, oftentimes at college or out partying. They haven't learned at home because they can't drink till they're 21. In Oregon, you can actually serve your biological child at home. And I have known very few parents who have taken advantage of that to try to take some of the allure of something that's forbidden. And so we want to be integrated into the world, and I'm not suggesting to you that you all go home and serve your children tonight. Please don't take that out of context. Did you hear that guy, what he said? What I'm saying is don't count on isolationism as a primary tool. Now, I'm actually going to skip this because I don't think in high school there is a lot of what I would call over-parenting occurs at this point because kids are really pushing you away. I want you to leave here tonight with an understanding that what you sometimes perceive as misbehavior may actually be individuation. It may be a developmental task that they're doing, and you want to differentiate between those. One of the ways to do this is to allow for ambivalence in your home. In other words, if your kid is confused about something and feeling two different things, maybe they feel way less committed than you do. Maybe they have questions about the authority of Scripture or about their spirituality or, is the Bible historical? And maybe these are things that cause you to feel a little bit threatened. And so your tendency might be to tell them the answer, which is exactly what you don't want to do. What you want to do is invite discussion and communicate to them that you value their thoughts and you value their feelings. Don't say to them, I value your thoughts, don't say that. Demonstrate it by sitting down and listening. And if they're saying something that is increasing your heart rate and causing you to sweat a little bit, listen all the more. Do not talk at that point. Because kids learn self-worth in part from their parents' attention and time. Those are the two commodities you have that are priceless. If you can give them your attention and you can give them your time, and it's way harder to do this, talking about this right here, than it is to do it where you're trying to do it. I was so relieved. It was 8th grade graduation. If you've had kids at this school, you know that at 8th grade graduation, the parents get up and say something. And I had felt bad for basically the last 4 years. I drove my son David to school here. It was a 25-minute drive, and it was silent. I'm thinking, shouldn't we be having like deep discussions and talking about really important things and all of that? And he's just not talking. And on the days that I picked him up, not talking. And so at graduation, so David was in Luke Siminci's class. They were actually real close friends. And when Greg got up to say his parenting piece, he said, well, this brings to a close the last 8 years of silence in our car. And I was like, oh, thank God that this wasn't just me. What I'm getting at is kids talk when they're ready, not at some prescribed plan that you have for them, which is really frustrating, because what it means is it means hours of availability and minutes of substantive talk. Because once they're convinced that they have your attention, and once they're convinced that they have your time, what's the next thing they're going to do? They're going to test it. Because that's what teenagers do. They test fences. They walk up to fences and check to see if this is an actual boundary or not. And if they find out, if you say to them, and we do this as parents, if you do that, I'm taking your iPhone away from you. And then they do it, and you're like, I didn't actually mean that, because you need it, because you need to call me, and I need to call you. And so I wasn't really thinking when I said that. So here, you can have that back. You just bought yourself a lot of days of difficult parenting because they've now learned you don't mean what you said. If I could wave a magic wand over parents, it would be follow through. Don't make threats that you are not going to follow through, or you can't follow through. I mean, sometimes we say things that we can't follow through on. So what you want to do is have time and availability for them, and you want to listen and summarize what they're saying. And maybe if you take one thing home tonight, because I know it's after a long day for you and you're tired and it's hard to pay attention, maybe write this down. Listening is not waiting your turn to talk. Listening is actually hearing what your teenager is saying, even if it sounds like ludicrous to you, like you are nuts and you do not, what news source are you listening to? I don't care, I largely don't care what they're saying. The important thing that's occurring right there, they're going to change their mind. Also, here's some good news. I have a chance to witness kids rejecting what their parents say in front of them, So like when I'm doing an intake and I've got the parents and the teens sitting right there, they've got their arms folded and they're on the end of the couch and they're being surly and they're arguing with their parents and saying no to this and no to that. Get the parents out of the room, put that kid in a group with other kids, they will repeat what their parents said. And they'll actually say, well, you know what my parents say? My parents say this. And they can own these things when they're not with you. If they own it when they're with you, you won. And they don't want you to win. They have to convince you that they're pushing away from you. So when you get things said, one of the mantras I use is at the appropriate moment, get things said and trust that. Don't need them to be obedient to that or to shake their head in agreement. Yeah, Dad, I now see the light. Thank you for sharing that with me. As a therapist, I can tell you with about 99% accuracy, your kids already know what you're going to say. They tell me this all the time. And sometimes they number your lectures. I know that that's a joke. It actually happens. Now, around lecturing, what I say is, if you want to give a lecture, give it. Just do it for yourself. Do not do it for your child because they are not gaining anything from that. They gain when you listen. And they learn from your behavior, not from your words. So, can you be a Christian and smoke marijuana? I used that because that kid asked me that 3 minutes from home one night. A good answer is to insert your thinking about that. They did ask you a question. A better answer is not to answer it and say, what do you think? The best answer, do you remember Sears, good, better, best? The best answer is, that is a really complicated and good question. What are your thoughts? Because one of the things I've learned when people ask questions is to be silent because they actually want to tell you what they think. And so what you want to do is, it's really hard, is to bite your tongue. I don't want my kid, marijuana is a gateway drug and they're going to start, don't go into that. Ask them what they think, so that they're sharing their thoughts with you and you become an askable parent. If your kids can emerge from home and go off to college or vocational school or get a job or move out, and they leave from home and they believe that you are an askable parent, you've had success in parenting. Because I think you probably know, for those of you that have already launched some kids, parenting's never done. You just do it a little less frequently. But as they age, you sit around, having your own anxiety because you can't control what they're doing. And sometimes bad things happen to them. My daughter Rachel, who is this isn't funny, I shouldn't have laughed. She's an emergency room physician. She and her sister Esther took a trip up to Seattle about 10 days ago. And on their way back down, Rachel stopped for gas. And it was Washington, it was self-serve, so she put the pump in the car, reached over and got the windshield washer thing, and then she was going to go wash her windshield, and she walked up to the pump, and she decided to jump over it. And so when she jumped over it, her foot caught, and she came down on the concrete, and she didn't break her fall with her hands. So she broke her fall with her left knee. So all of her weight was on the V of the knee hitting the pavement, concrete, and when it hit the concrete, her femur snapped. And that's, for those of you that know, that's one of the most painful things that can happen. And so she, surgery, plates, and all of this. And as a parent, we showed up at the hospital, and she's on her phone. She's the medical director for her doctor group, and they want her back at work right now. And because we're already short on doctors, and she's not weight bearing, and and then she came to our house because Hollis and I were off for a week, and so she spent the first week convalescing at our house. And I'm watching her. She lives on her devices because she's managing patients and dealing with other doctors, and she's responsible for scheduling. And on about the 5th day, I walked out into the living room. She was restricted to the couch, and we were serving her. And I sat down, and we were just sitting there, and she said, how soon do you think I should go back to work? I mean, it took 5 days for her to ask what I thought. And you want to be askable. You don't want to be the parent where they already know what you're thinking, and so I don't need to ask them about that. Facilitate failure. I don't even like the word failure. I know that Lance Armstrong is super controversial, and a lot of people don't like him. I do want to say, and he also knows he's a narcissist. If you've read his books, he talks about himself being a narcissist. He blames his marriage failure on himself, and then he goes right back out and is a narcissist again. So that's not cool. But one of the things that he said in his book, Every Second Counts, and I do want to remind you, he had 3 different types of cancer that he came back from, and as far as I'm concerned, they should have just eliminated the rules for him. You have 3 forms of cancer, you can do whatever you want to try and get back on the cycling circuit. And in his book, Every Second Counts, he says flat out, I have never learned anything when I've won. I only learn when I lose. And I think there's a nugget of truth there. When your kids are struggling, you've got to think of that as an opportunity for learning. And you want to be there for the debrief discussion, if you will. So they're going to be taking risks. They're going to be in high school competitions. They may go to state on speech and debate, and they may get there and get crushed. They might win. They might not. These are hard things for them. One of the things that I do want to try to correct is we as parents view the world as a scary place. And I wrote an article about this, and it's the one that I got the most hate mail for. The data does not support that. There's never been safer to be alive than right now. The problem is the device that you're holding in your hand tells you about something that happened to a teenager in Florida, and you read it and you're like, oh no, this is what happens. How many kids have been poisoned by Halloween candy in the history of Halloween? I mean, this started, I'm 63. I remember my mom said, because we got tons of homemade, stuff on the street, and she said, if you get an apple, don't eat it, because people are putting razor blades in them. And I'm 10, and I'm like, what? Who would do that? So there's one documented case, and it happened 4 days after Halloween, where a stepfather tried to off his non-biological son by poisoning candy. So there's a case right there. There's a couple cases that are questionable. They don't know at what point the candy had a foreign substance put onto it. In terms of documentable cases, less than 4. And yet we ask a 10-year-old, what's the chances you're going to get poisoned by your Halloween candy? I don't know, probably 1 in 2, maybe, something like that. We've done this because we watch so much on the news that we're afraid it's going to happen right here, and it's not. So I just want to encourage you to try to help your kids see the world in a positive way, because there are good things that are happening. So when you have your kid didn't get invited to the party, they missed the winning shot, they lost the game, they didn't win the championship. How many people watched the NCAA championship game? My wife Jillian graduated from UNC. Living in Chapel Hill was the first time I actually learned what it meant to be a sports fan, because people bleed Carolina blue. I was in church in Chapel Hill one time. It was an evangelical church, and somebody stood up on a Sunday morning and prayed for the Tar Heels to win. And the pastor had to get up. It was like 500 people. The pastor had to get up and go, okay, so what he meant was, Tar Heels had the game in the bag, and then the biggest comeback in the history of NCAA championship games, and they lost to Kansas in the final minute. And so you had a dozen players there that reached to the pinnacle of their sports career, and they lost. and they have to overcome that. And your job is to facilitate those moments. And the main thing you want to do, so all of the studies on resilience with kids who have resilience were in a home where at some point they said, what did we learn? So whatever it is that went wrong, at some point you turn that over and you say, what did we learn from this? In some way. Now, it requires a lot of sitting. So when the kid just lost the NCAA double championship, you don't say, well, what did we learn tonight? You wait until we've licked our wounds, and we're trying to figure out now, what do I do with I'm saddled with this loss for the rest of my life. And when they're actually processing it, they'll ask you. And that's where you want to be sitting there to be the person that they ask about that, because now they're actually listening. Hollis was sitting at our front porch it was probably 10 years ago now, and it was a sunny late spring day. And she was just outside enjoying the afternoon, and there was a big plop on the table in front of her, and it was a baby hummingbird. And she looked up, and there was a nest in the beam on the porch, and she sat there with her phone for the next hour, and I guess it was the mother bird pushed all of the little birds off the beam, and they all fluttered and plopped on the table, and then the railing was only about 2 feet away, and she facilitated getting them onto the railing, and then they all flew away. I remember driving away at Whitworth when we dropped Esther off. You know, she's gone. I mean, this is it. She actually, I don't think she's lived at home since then. And we were driving away, and I'm having, a dad moment right there. And she's running across this big green area toward the gym where the students were meeting. And she was in a bright yellow dress. Look at me. And she was skipping. I don't think she could have been happier in that moment. My parents are gone, and I'm off at college. Parent with the end in mind. They're leaving. If you have right now a high school freshman, say it's the end of their freshman year, so just roughly do rough numbers here because I'm not great at math. They got 3 years left. That means you have 150 weekends. How many of those weekends are they going to want to spend with you? And on the weekends they do spend with you, how many hours will they actually spend with you? And if I was doing this with a father one night in a counseling session, and he started crying. It's kind of a negative way of thinking, but you have to be present so that you can facilitate consequences. Consequences are a much better teacher than your lessons are. So when they do something wrong and they face the punishment. My son David got expelled at Sandy High School 90 days into the school year. And he will tell you today it was probably one of the best things, and as parents, I'll tell you it was one of the best things that could have happened. Sally Tripp was the vice principal at that time, and what David did, in case you were wondering, what is your kid, a drug dealer? Yes, he is a drug dealer. He sold 9 Adderall pills to another kid for $5, and Sally Tripp was standing where you're sitting, and she watched him hand over a plastic bag and receive a $5 bill. And she went down to the resource officer at the time, his name was Kevin, and she said, could you pull the film up from the hallway? And they watched it on the film because the whole school, except for the bathrooms, is on film. And they went and got the kids out of class, said, empty your pockets. David told me he was on the way down to the office, and he goes, why am I going to the office? Could it be about those pills? I don't think that's what it is. Empties, where'd you get $5? Well, I sold my Adderall to another student. Kevin turned him around and handcuffed him and put him in his car. And the phone call I got at 5 o'clock in between clients, I walked into my office, checked my phone. I had the Sandy High School number memorized, so I was like, oh, Sandy High School, 5 o'clock? So I listened to the message, your son David has been arrested and transported to the juvenile detention center. You can pick him up tonight after 8 o'clock. Click. That was one of the darker parenting moments. But thank God Sally was paying attention. And thank God she followed through. I'm not worried about kids who act out because that's what they do. I'm worried about kids who act out and nobody's paying attention. And your job as a parent is to be paying attention. Failure or problems, think of it as disequilibrium in your child's life. Imagine a child that grew up and got everything they wanted and won every sporting event that they were in, never faced any adversity, succeeded at everything they did. What kind of 18-year-old do I have? Probably a self-centered narcissist at this point. You actually want them to face adversity because the rule is no disequilibrium, no growth. So that 18-year-old that I just described is essentially still have the attitude of a 1 or 2-year-old who thinks everything revolves around them. And you got to get knocked around to realize it doesn't actually revolve around me. And you're the parent that's facilitating it doesn't revolve around you. So one of the ways to do this is when they ask you to do something, try saying yes to everything. Everything they ask. What do you get asked by your teenagers? Yours are 13, what is it? Sleepovers. Okay, are you okay with that? Okay. What you do is you say, yes, you can go under the following circumstances. And then you lay out the circumstances. If they say, can I go away on the weekend with my friends? We're going to go camping, and it's a 17-year-old. Yes, you can go if your grades are all B's and, put in your criteria. Here's criteria 1, here's criteria 2. Criteria 3 is 2 adults from the parents of the group are going with you. Criteria 4, criteria 5. Don't say no. I watch parents, and the kids have barely finished the question, and the parents are like, no. And now we have adversity. We're fighting with each other. And you don't want that adversity to be coming from you. You want it to come from maybe your expectations. It's reasonable for you to do an activity like that all your homework's done. Probably, this is going to sound really silly to you, but one of my pained parenting memories, so my daughter Rachel was obedient out the chute. I don't know that we ever disciplined her, except this time. She's 10 years old. She and her friends are into American Girls dolls. Did some of you play with American Girls dolls? It's a big deal. And so they were having an American Girls birthday party, and it was on Saturday at 2 o'clock, and it's, all week long they're all talking about it. And so Jillian and I said to her, you can go if your homework's done and your room's clean. And so each day I said, you can go on Saturday if your homework's done and your room's clean. Well, for the first time in her life, she didn't clean her room. Like, it literally is like the first time in her life, and it's time to go. And I had to follow through with what I said. And she cried, and what I really wanted to do was allow her to go to address my problem. And it would have been a wrong decision to say, you know what, even though I said that for the last 6 days in a row, I'm going to let you go because you're such a great kid. Okay, so you don't actually mean what you say. So you want the expectations to create the problems and to face the consequences, and you've got to change the I'm going to be a wall and protect you from the world to I want you to be in the world, but here's the conditions under which you can do that, because they are leaving you. And so my thought is have them know how to do everything that they need to do to be an adult by age 18. And that is a tall task to be able to do that. So let's go to right. I'm going to leave this up right here. These are the things that build parent-child connectedness. And I want to take kind of the last 15 minutes just to open it up for questions, application questions. Here's what's happening in my house. Here's what my kid's doing. Here's the current problem we're facing. Here's where we're stuck. We seem to repeat ourselves. So what would you like to know? Yes? No, sorry. I did write a book, but it will be of no help to you. I wrote a book about building a treehouse. So this is true. We have the Mount Hood Magical Treehouse on our property, and I wrote a book about that. So. Yes?
If your child brings home a friend and you watch them interact for the play evening or whatever, and you decide from just monitoring and watching, this is not a good friend. This friend is influencing your child to lie or be deceitful to you. Might not be saying positive things to the kid, might have some underlying background issues. Kid wants to.
Did you guys hear that? Okay. Really common.
And I'm thinking middle school age too, because that's offensive, right?
Middle school, so the transition from middle school to high school is, in middle school you should be a very directive coach who is hands-on, showing them how to swing the bat, demonstrating it, you're right there present. In high school, you want to take a step back and be more of a coach who's available and is coaching real life situations. So there would be a difference in the response, but a couple of things strike me. There's a real problem right here. Your kid brings home a friend that you observe is teaching them values that we don't hold as a family. You're in a catch-22 position because if you say that to your kid, so your friend doesn't support our family values, what is the likely developmental response of the kid? Yeah. And they're going to, because they want to decide for themselves. So you've heard the saying, have your friends close, have your enemies closer. I would look for an opportunity to include this kid in our family activities. I mean, I would want them right there because, now I'm saying this providing the kid is not like actively bringing meth into your home or, something that is like, this is outside of, this is illegal. We can't do this. What you want to do is be present for their interactions. So ideally, you can debrief with your kid at other times. What did you think about it when they did this? Or how did that feel? I noticed that actually they weren't listening to you and they were doing what they wanted to do. What was that like for you? So that you come to them, you have to parent like this, you have to become genuinely curious. You really have to think, I don't necessarily know the way my kid thinks, and I want to know. And so I want to know your thinking about what you saw with her. Now, there may be moments, and we can't discuss, every possible scenario here, but there may be moments where a line is crossed and you are going to have to take direct action, particularly in middle school. We had an instance, which was middle school, where it was actually the property behind us. It's on a separate road, but we thought we knew the parents, and so there was an overnight birthday party, and they were neighbors and all of that, and we've trained our kid. Anyway, when Hollis went to pick Dylan up in the morning, he was underneath the kitchen table, and the parents were drunk and passed out, didn't answer the door, and the place was in complete disarray. That's a situation where you're probably not going back over there. That we're going to take direct action to protect you from this right here. Now, with a teenager, I probably would still try to be coaching in that situation in terms of what was that like for you. Because remember, by the time they're a teenager, they're probably going to be a setting at school where that happens. And our job is to prepare them for that moment. And having instructed them as what to do in that moment versus having coached them in that moment is two very different things. When Peter went off to school, he was our only kid that wanted to join a fraternity. I was not in a fraternity. Azusa didn't have them. I had a pretty negative picture of fraternities. It was at a tech school where probably a quarter of the incoming class were valedictorians of their high school classes. This was really difficult to get into. So I thought, well, you know, these are kids who are into academics. Got a nice letter from the academic advisor about the fraternity. This one advisor advised this 70-person fraternity. We go to visit. So he got admitted to the fraternity. Say it's halfway through the second semester, we go to visit. I actually hesitate to say this on tape. So the first thing, the school was in Indiana. The first thing that was striking is that there were guns everywhere. These college students had guns on campus in their rooms. It was probably more rooms that had guns in them that didn't. Second thing was drinking was prolific. The amount of drinking, first of all, it was illegal. The kids were under 21, and the college didn't do anything about it. I mean, it had a faculty advisor. Third thing that was scary was they had a sex room. And as a parent of two girls, Hollis particularly reacted to that. And this is the fraternity that we got Peter ready to be in. And to his credit, he banded up with 9 other students, and they made a pact together that they were not going to drink in college. And how he did this, I got to tell you, how he exerted that self-control is amazing to me. He ended up getting elected president of the fraternity his senior year, and did it without participating in those activities. It was bad enough that his junior year, the fraternity next door, Peter was sitting in class, and phones started going off, and one of the kids got up and bolted out the door, and a kid in the fraternity next door was drunk and had gone outside and shot himself and killed himself. And these college students were exposed to this. And I mean, think about, what do you have to have in place for a kid to be ready for this level of stuff? The suicides may be a little unusual. The other stuff is not unusual. And so that's where, if I can coach the kid right now in my home, it's going to be too late. If I haven't done it at home, it's going to be too late. They may not even tell me about it when it occurs there. So the scenario you're putting out there, I have to say to you, these are not black and white things. This is more artwork than it is like precise mathematics. And allow yourself to make mistakes 49% of the time. What you're shooting for is getting it right 51% of the time. I'm sorry, for the second time, how old are your kids, Andre?
17, 15, 13.
Okay, so you have 3 teenagers. What are the genders?
Boy, girl, boy.
Boy, girl, so you want some of both. Just off the cuff, rate your own parenting. How many times do you get it right?
Having sat under you for years as a grad student, still pretty low.
Do you get 50%?
I'd like to think, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, I said earlier, don't parent for obedience. That is not, just because your kid's obedient doesn't mean a thing. It means what they did was learn the rule, and they obeyed it in your presence. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that when you remove the ruling authority, people stop obeying. They start running traffic lights at 2 a.m. because why should I stop? Parent for character qualities. So all the way through our kids' childhood, once a year we sat down and we talked about each kid. What is the character quality that this kid needs? And then after we identified it, we thought, well, how do we get there? I mean, what kind of things do we have to facilitate in order to move them to being more thoughtful? Our son Aiden, the area of autism and Asperger's is pretty controversial. Asperger's has actually been removed from the diagnostic manual, but he was diagnosed with Asperger's, and he was on spectrum when he was in grade school and high school. He's the kid who used to have Asperger's and grew out of it. And so one day we're out in the driveway, and I was having the kids do chores, and so those 3 teenage boys, they're out there cleaning. And he was blowing. I had forgotten about this until his junior year of college. We went back to see him in New York, and we're sitting at dinner, and he goes, "Do you remember the time in the driveway where we were working, and I was running the blower, and I came over to you, and I took my headphones off, and I said to you, 'I'm too smart for manual labor'?" And he said, "You flipped your shit." And I don't remember this, but I can tell you I'm absolutely sure he's recounting what did happen. That would not have gone over well with me. The next thing he said was he laughed and he said, "Can you believe I said that? I'm so embarrassed." So he developed, remember I told you their brains develop, at age 16 or whatever, he's saying this socially inappropriate thing. He was the kid who would cut in front of the other kids, in the line for pizza in the kitchen. And I had to take him, and I said, "Aiden, so I just wanted to share something with you. When you take the biggest piece, when you take the last piece, when you cut in line, the other person feels negatively towards you." And he said, "Really?" It's like, "Yes." And he literally turned around to his sibling and said, "Would you like to go first?" Now, as Asperger's kid, he was directable, but these were hard things for him to learn. At his 18th birthday party, he invited a group of high school students to meet him at Smoky Hearth for pizza and then to go to a movie together, and 7 of them said they would come, and he went over there and nobody showed up. And on the way home from the theater to our house, which is on the other side of Sandy, he ran a stop sign and got a ticket. This is a bad 18th birthday. And when he got home that night, you want to have been the kind of parent that he can talk to, because you want to be present to talk through what it was like to not have one single friend show up. Now, the story has a pretty good phase right now. He went to a tech school that was 95% male, and he got one of the females. He's married today, and she is a rock star. We love her because what happened is through whatever happened at college and whatever training we did and whatever neurological development was going on, he eventually developed other person perspective. And he's super kind these days. My parents are really struggling right now. They're 90, and I was out there on Saturday, and he had said he might come help me, and he was texting me and apologizing. They only have one car. Rachel has the car today. I'm not going to be able to come. I promise I'm going to come, another weekend. That's the kind of kid he's turned into. We had sleepless nights that he was going to end up in a $700 apartment in Gresham playing video games. I mean, we literally had that picture in our heads. And most of the stuff that you worry about as a parent of a teenager doesn't actually happen. Just so you know that. I know that doesn't help you a lick right now. Later you'll say, he was right, honey, when you guys were 65 years old. Do you remember that guy that said? What other questions? Any other questions? Yes.
18-year-old kid who is in every way like self-motivated and character is fantastic, but our failure has to allow her to be so busy that she is not taking personal responsibility at home for helping in any way, including her own identified animals. And Dad and I
Yep.
have just swept in and taken care of that. So where's the balance of, we're not going to allow your animals to starve, but we've also allowed you as the now adult to be so busy that you are thwarting your responsibilities. Totally on us, I accept that. But she's also out of school in 2 months, and is there a point to change this, or is there a discussion to be had, or what?
So first of all, there isn't really much. So she's saying that her daughter's going to graduate in 2 months. Does she have plans for next year yet? Working on it. Do you anticipate she'll be gone?
Yes.
Okay. So also know that when your kids leave, I said earlier, they should be trained to do everything they're going to need to do as an adult. Yeah, right, Dave. That is not going to happen. There's going to be things that your kids don't get. Peter did not get cleaning, even though we really emphasized cleaning in our house, and the boys had to help clean, and they all knew how to clean the toilet. when he left for college, his room needed detoxification. 2 months into his freshman year, I get a phone call, and he's crying. And he was at this school where they had overpacked the dorms. They admitted more students than they had dorm space. So the rooms were built for 2. They had 3 in there, so it was pretty tight quarters. And he came back from class, and he was so messy, his roommates had taken all of his belongings and put them in the hallway as a message to him. And this is what he came back to. And he was crying. And as a dad, I got kind of upset. I was like, I think I actually said, don't do this. I think I actually said to him, do you want me to call the RA? And he's like, no, I'll take care of this. He is by far, out of all 6 of our kids, the neatest, cleanest person today. He learned it elsewhere. The world will teach your kids lessons. So you're not going to have taught them everything. In the case that you're presenting, I don't think you can change anything behaviorally at this point that's going to make a difference. And on behalf of PETA, I would say rescue the animals. I have, you may think this is cruel, I have let a fish die because I thought that it was a fish. And it doesn't have a very big nervous system, and that's probably going to die soon anyway. So I want the kid to have that lesson of that. I know that that sounds, I believe in consequences. With these animals, I would rescue them. I would probably try to get rid of them, though. In other words, if they're her animals and she hasn't taken care of them, you have to ask yourself, what would the consequence of that be? And you shouldn't have them. Who wants a horse? They are pointing at you. Yeah. There may be a taker over here if you. Yeah. What I would look for is opportunities. So do this. Instead of evaluating your kid, ask them to evaluate themselves. Self-evaluation is way more powerful than your evaluation of them. They kind of already know what your evaluation is of them because it's leaked out through your body language and things you said. Yes?
I mean, she's the kind of kid who feels like she's failing us, and she has verbalized that. So it's really hard to add that you're thwarting your responsibilities onto that self-pile guilt. So that's what the pickle we're in. Like I said, in every other way, she's fantastic character and everything else. So it's like
knowing 3 things about the situation, I'm hopeful. I mean,
I am too.
Yeah.
And she's number 4, and yeah.
4 of
Number 4.
of 4 of 4. Well, heck, this is
But still,
yeah. Yeah.
they're all alive.
Yes. What I try to do with kids, she's describing a kid who's hard on herself, and then so that sort of defeats you from being able to be hard on them because they're already kicking themselves. One of the things I like to do in a situation like that is when they're kicking themselves, because I would have the conversation, then they start kicking themselves. I would be prepared with 2 to 3 statements where you state a particular character quality and then you follow it up with an observation of when you saw it. So if you think that your child is kind or patient or courageous, during this discussion, what you want to do is you want to say, well, it didn't go well with these animals, and we can't sugarcoat that. And we probably participated with you in not providing the guidance that you needed. And even though this is true, I remember when I saw you do this. Because what you want to do is you want to observe, don't tell your kids they're wonderful, amazing, the best kids ever. Don't use any generalizations because they know it's hogwash. What you want to do is state a specific quality, and then you want to state the instance in which you saw it. And you really want to do this throughout their life because you're going to have situations, I remember getting the phone call from Peter. He was working for TI. He's in Minneapolis. He's 2,400 miles away. And they basically were ready to fire him. And this was a really dark moment in his career. And again, you want to be askable. And at that point, during those conversations, you're still going to be saying, okay, this is rough. Now, when they're 25 and this is happening to them, what you want to say to them is, I believe you've got this. This is going to be hard, but I believe you've got it. You want to communicate confidence in them. You don't want to say, I'll help you fix this, we've got this. They need to hear from you that they're capable. So my argument would be that I would go for self-evaluation discussions. I would notice, and just do this ongoing, I would notice the positive character qualities, and I would be the parent who remains askable. This personality style that you're describing, she's probably gonna struggle with harsh self-talk for a long time. That's not something you can eradicate, and it's not necessarily parenting, by the way. The more we learn about genetics, the less I'm thinking that you have much control in the environment. At best, I'd say you have about 50% control. But in a lot of areas, you don't even have 50% control in terms of the effect of genetics. Okay, it's time to wrap up. I know this is a lot harder to do than it is to talk about, but I believe you guys have got it. So, thank you.